Hello everybody and welcome to today's video, a guide to AQA English Literature Paper 2 Section B, Anthology Poetry. If you're taking your exams in 2024, you'll be answering a question on one of these two clusters. If you're taking exams from 2025 onwards, you'll be answering a question on one of these three clusters. Section B is worth 30 marks and you should spend around 45 minutes on it. This section of the exam will require you to compare two poems from the cluster you've studied. One poem will be printed in the exam paper along with a question, and you must then choose a second poem to compare it with. The assessment objectives in this section are AO1, 2 and 3, and we'll start with a guide to what each of these means with specific examples for power and conflict poetry. AO1 is all about response to task and text using supporting references. It goes without saying that you need to know the poems inside out. Yes, you'll be provided with one in the exam, but you don't know which poem it's going to be, and the question will ask you to compare that poem with another, and you don't have the anthology, you don't have any of the other poems with you. So my suggestion is that you need to know all 15 poems well. The most important thing about this exam, and in fact both literature exams, is the idea of response to task, i.e. answering the question. That underpins everything else. Your number one priority in the literature exams is to answer the questions. Now that might sound obvious, but time and time again in past exams what we've seen is a number of students who know something very clever about a poem and want to force that into their answer no matter what the question is. Don't let that be you. Priority number one needs to be to answer the question. Just because you know something about the use of dactylic dimeter in the Charge of the Light Brigade, it doesn't mean you can force it into your answer, only if it's relevant to the question. You want to aim for a conceptualized response, a hypothesis, a line of argument which is explored throughout your answer. Rather than an answer made up of disjointed or repeated paragraphs, a conceptualized response has one clear, progressive line of argument all the way through. It's a well-structured essay. Now there are 2 points that came up in past exam reports which I think are really important when it comes to AO1. First, and this is a paraphrase of a comment from the 2019 report, is that students who focused their analysis on ideas rather than methods were often more successful. Now what that means is this. Let's say our question is about the presentation of war in the Charge of the Light Brigade, and we reread and annotate it and pick out the ballad form, the religious imagery and the dactylic dimeter. Well, that doesn't then mean in looking for our second poem we should look for one that uses form, imagery and meter for effect like the first one. No, what we want to do is reread the poem with the question in mind and come up with our idea about what it says in terms of the question, perhaps that it praises the bravery of those involved in war while subtly highlighting its pointlessness, and with that in mind we then think about a second poem to compare. The second important thing is we do want to present a structured line of argument in our answer, rather than just essentially writing the same thing again and again in different ways. And this is so important. This is, again, a paraphrase from something taken from the 2019 exam report. Some students write multiple paragraphs that are quite alike, showing the same level of understanding again and again, instead of advancing their argument. That phrase is so important, advancing the argument. These students could improve by learning how to develop, structure and employ an essay to illustrate a perspective or answer a question. So what I like to do is look for comparisons where there's a two-part line of argument, so I don't just end up repeating the same points time and time again. And I'll show you how we do just that. So let's focus on this question for today's video. Compare how poets present power in Ozymandias and one other poem. Now the way I would approach this is I would reread the named poem, pen in hand, annotating it with anything I think is important in terms of the question, so in this case the presentation of power. And for Ozymandias I might pick out the use of the sonnet form and how it reflects Ozymandias' self-love and perception of his own power. I might pick out the religious language of King of Kings and make a similar point. Ozymandias sees himself as godlike because these are words used to describe God in the Bible. And in terms of power then, here is someone who thinks they are absolutely all-powerful. But, this is the second part of the argument, it's also clear that sense of power is misguided. For a start, the statue now stands crumbled and in the middle of nowhere, and the way the poem is a sonnet but one which is continually adapting and changing, lacking consistency. If you don't understand that, watch my video on Ozymandias, but it's got some elements of the Petrarchan sonnet, some of the Shakespearean sonnet, and some other form of sonnet, something different again, reflects how power is not absolute, but is transient transitory and open to change. So that rereading of the named poem with the question in mind will give me my concept that Ozymandias presents someone who thinks they are all-powerful, but shows how that sense of power is an illusion, it will not last. Now with that in mind, I'll then flick back a page to the list of poems, which is a whole list of all of the titles in the question paper, and I'll browse through each title one by one, considering which poem to compare with that line of argument. And of course there will be some that are absolute no's, some that are maybes, and then I'll think about the maybes and think about the one that compares best, not just in one way, but ideally to this two-part line of argument. The first part, this presentation of someone who thinks they're all-powerful, and the second part, how that sense of power is an illusion. And there are a number of poems you can choose here. I think I would personally choose My Last Duchess, where the Duke has this sense of power reflected through the use of the dramatic monologue form, where he's the only one speaking and the listener remains silent throughout, but that sense of power is undermined through the fact that the poem is one long stanza filled with enjambment, as if the Duke can't control what he's saying, he's just blurting out all of this information. And then I've got my concept, which will also function as my introduction, which is this. Both Ozymandias and My Last Duchess present speakers who believe they are powerful, but ultimately the reader learns this sense of power is an illusion. And that's my two-part line of argument. I'm going to perhaps spend the first half of my answer looking at the sense of power, and the second half looking at how it's an illusion. Everything in my answer then becomes part of the theory or concept I'm exploring, and it's not just repeating one point over and over again. So for AO1, that conceptualized response is likely to come out of careful choice of the second poem, reading the named poem with the question in mind and then choosing a second poem that connects well with that. And whilst we're here, what about this introductory statement? Lots of people ask me, should I write an introduction and conclusion? And we did have some helpful advice on this in a past exam report, which said there aren't necessarily any marks given for an introduction, but writing a brief intro like this gives you a guideline to write to and something to keep glancing back at to make sure you're not wandering off topic. So it doesn't need to be a really long paragraph. I see super long introductions. I actually think a couple of lines setting out your concept is perfect. Now the next part of AO1 is about supporting references. Exam reports have pointed out time and time again that this can be a quotation from the text, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a reference to something that happens in the text, a paraphrase, or a direct quotation. Now you don't have that second poem, so you aren't expected to have memorised everything, which is really useful. AO2 is an interesting one. Assessment objectives are set by Ofqual and are the same across all GCSE exam boards for English literature. The actual assessment objective is analyse language, form and structure, and up until the 2022 exams, the AQA mark scheme did actually list analysis of language and form and structure in the top band, but now there's been a helpful tweak to the mark scheme, which refers more broadly to analysis of methods. So what's happening here? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, it comes back to the point I've already made, that your primary objective in these exams is answering the question. AQA don't want anyone to feel they have to include, let's say, a paragraph on structure or a paragraph on form. It is okay to do that, but, and here's the crucial point, only if it actually adds something useful to your analysis and your answering of the question. And that isn't always going to be the case. The widening of the mark scheme to this term methods is there to say, look, there is no requirement to write about any one specific method. You just bring anything that's relevant to your answer. Of course, the assessment objective remains AO2, language, form and structure, so it's never wrong to study these areas, but when we're in an exam, we think first and foremost about answering the question and bring in anything relevant to our answer, and the key word is relevant. And it's also important not to have a narrow view of what is meant by AO2. If it's a method the writer's used and it's relevant to your answer, you can write about it. So let's look at some things to do with AO2, but do remember it's not an exhaustive list. If there's a method that's used relevant to the point you're making, you can include it in your response. Language is all about a poet's use of words, phrases and language features for effect. Now this includes figurative language such as similes, metaphors, personification, onomatopoeia, that kind of thing, but it's wider than that too. One way I like to look at language analysis is to ask, where has the poet used a word or phrase where another one would have been fine, but they seem to have chosen that one for a specific effect. So going back to Ozymandias, the biblical language of King of Kings would be language analysis, as would analysing the sounds the word makes with that hard alliterative k sound, reflecting the hard, harsh nature Ozymandias rules by. Structure is about how the poem is organised, the order things take place in, less about what's happening in a poem and more about where it's happening and why. So the fact that My Last Duchess is one long stanza filled with enjambment, reflecting the lack of power and control the Duke actually has in reality because he can't stop himself from blurting out this information, that is a structure point. Interestingly, the 2023 exam report made it clear that students still find it difficult to explore structure effectively. So this is the key thing. Don't bring it into your answer unless it is really relevant to the point you're making. There's no benefit to showing off your knowledge of structure or any other method unless it is relevant to your answer. From past exam reports, this seems to be particularly relevant to poetry answers, that students feel they have to bolt on a paragraph on structure, then bolt on a paragraph on form. But it comes back to the point I made earlier, answering the question is key. If it's relevant to your answer, fine, but otherwise, don't bother. Form means the type of poem you're studying. That might be a sonnet, like Ozymandias, a dramatic monologue, like we see here with My Last Duchess, a ballad, like The Charge of the Light Brigade, but many of the poems don't follow any specific form, and that's fine. You don't have to write about form. And also, you might find that you know the form of the poem, but writing about it wouldn't be relevant to your question. In that case, don't write about it. AO3 is context. Now, the term can be understood in a variety of ways and will vary depending upon which text you're studying. Context can mean when the text was written, when and where the text is set, literary context and genre, or responses from different readers. However, the section in the mark scheme about AO3 references ideas and perspectives as well as contextual factors, and the 2018 exam report said, and again this is a paraphrase, it's essential for you to know that context is referenced in the wording of the question. So it comes back to my initial point from the beginning of the video. If you're fully answering the question, addressing all the parts of the question, you'll be hitting all of the relevant areas of the mark scheme. Now, I've got a full answer to this question in my literature guide, which has just been updated to a second edition. You can download it instantly in ebook at mrbruff.com or get the paperback on Amazon. And if you found this video useful, please do subscribe to the channel.